I'll hand you over to Karen very shortly, and she can introduce herself. Suffice to say, she's a hugely experienced journalist in the kind of issues that we are covering on the course, and I know from her previous webinars that you will learn a lot from her. So, Karen, welcome. Just a couple of sort of housekeeping things from me. This is the third webinar, so you know the score by now. You can use the smiley face icon at the bottom of the attendee list to raise your hand like that, or to agree or disagree like this if you want. But please do remember to clear your status afterwards if you use that facility. And you can use the chat room down at the bottom to ask any questions as we go along. What I'll be doing is I'll keep an eye on the questions as they come in, and then every now and again, Karen will take a little break, and I will kind of try and group the questions together so that they make sense. So often times we'll get duplicate questions or ones that are very similar. So don't worry if I don't read your exact one out, because it means that we will try and cover it from somebody else's question. So that's like I said, we've done this a couple of times before, so we should know. Try not to answer each other's questions or start talking to each other in the chat room, because that kind of becomes extremely confusing for everybody. So having said that, Karen, I'm going to hand over to you and talk to you in a bit. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Martin. And thanks to all of you for showing up for this. I've done a few of these now, and I always feel a little bit strange because it's kind of like talking to myself. I definitely prefer being in a classroom with people and interacting directly, and I wish that could be as interactive as possible. And like Martin said, if you have questions, please step up and ask them throughout. I'm happy to answer your questions about anything that we're discussing today. So a little bit about me. I've been a journalist for a little over 20 years now professionally, and I live in New Mexico in the Southwest US, but I've done most of my reporting in developing countries. I lived for a long time in Southeast Asia. When I was in grad school, I spent a semester in Vietnam and just fell in love with the people and the cultures. And the next year, I took a job at the Cambodia Daily, which is an English language paper in Phnom Penh. And I was recently married. My husband, Jerry Redfern, is a photojournalist, and we often work together. And so we moved that year to Cambodia, and it was a really difficult year for us because it was 1998, the end of the Khmer Rouge War. It was an election year. There was a lot of violence, a lot of riots, protests, and it was just really tough, especially being newlyweds. So we were there for a little over a year and then came back to the US for a bit, but it didn't take long for us to realize that reporting internationally and living in other cultures, it was really, it was in our blood. And soon we moved back to Southeast Asia again, lived in Cambodia again and Thailand, and reported throughout the region, mostly on development issues and often with minority communities. What else? Let's see. So I'm also a food writer. A lot of my audiences know me specifically as a food writer because I used to be a correspondent for Gourmet magazine when I was living in Asia. And I also have a food blog. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into things about how I use food as sort of an entree into people's lives and communities and a way to relate to them. And I've also written 4 books, 3 of which are about Asia and development issues in the regions there. As we get into this, I wanted to tell you about a guy named Jim Harris. He's many things to me. He is a source, a fixer, a connector, networker. He's a character in some of my stories. Jim is an American who, for the last 18 years or so, has been going annually to Laos He's the only American on the ground there working to clear unexploded bombs that are left over from the US bombing campaign in Laos 40, 50 years ago. Jerry and I ended up doing a book on this issue. It was something that we'd encountered while living and working in Asia. And one year when we were on assignment for a magazine story in Laos, we were working on an archaeology story, but came across several accident victims who had been blown up by these bombs. Laos per capita is the most heavily bombed country in the world. It's something that most Americans don't know, don't understand that part of the history of the Vietnam War, that actually Laos next door suffers incredibly still from all of these bombs left on the ground. And so Jim, we met in some of our reporting trips to Laos. He every year takes a team into very remote areas, often in hill tribe minority areas, to clear bombs that have never been cleared. These are some of the places where he works. People for 40 years have had bombs in the ground in their yard or in their field, and no one before him had ever come to try to remove them. And so we've spent a few weeks with Jim in the field in Laos. We've camped together, we've gone out with his bomb removal team, watched him work. And also, it just so happens that Jim is from my home state of Wisconsin. And when I've gone back to see my family in Wisconsin, I often go and meet Jim. And here he is just this past week. I was home for a family wedding, and we went up to see him up north. He lives on a 40-acre farm, and during the summertime, every year, he offers up most of that land to the local Hmong community to garden. He has 60 plots, and people fight over it. It's such a wanted and needed thing in the area. The Hmong people there in his community are actually why he started working in Laos, because he used to be a school principal and teacher. And after the war, he started noticing this huge influx of minority Hmong people. And they were all fleeing Laos and sponsored by different organizations to come to the US. So as a school teacher, he was interested in, who are these people entering my community here? And so he started to get to know them, getting to know their culture. He would gather letters and things that people around him wanted to send back to Laos. And so he started making trips to Laos and connecting people across these borders. And this has been going on for decades now. So obviously, Jim has a very rich life, and here he is with his wife Marty, and together they work in the US and in Laos to help victims of war. In fact, he started an NGO called We Help War Victims. And I've learned so much from Jim, and as I was saying, I think the reason why I'm telling you about him is because he is sort of an example of many of the things that I'll be talking about in dealing with sources. He has connected me to this Hmong community and led me to other stories about their culture within the Midwest in the US and the foods that they eat. We're now starting to look into a story about former child soldiers who were Hmong children at the time during the war who now live in the US, and how they've socialized and how they've gone on with their lives. And this is all possible because of the network and the connections that I've made through Jim. So again, he's been a source to me because he's the subject of a profile I did on him. He's a chapter in our book on unexploded ordnance in Laos. And he's also sort of a fixer. And although I don't really like that term, he has led me to many other people to do different types of stories on. So it's just, okay. Moving along, this year, as I was saying, I've done most of my reporting in Asia, but this year I had an opportunity to travel to Uganda and Rwanda through the International Women's Media Foundation on a fellowship to report on rural development. And I've been looking at lately at food security issues around the world. And I applied for this because I knew that to really, take a good look at food security globally, I obviously have to get my foot in the door in Africa. And so I thought this was a fantastic way to do that, because the reporting fellowship was organized by this group. They set up contacts, they sort of paved our way. And I found through years of reporting in other countries, it's really hard to do that on your own. It takes a lot of time to build up that sort of entryway and get to know contacts on the ground. So if you have an opportunity for someone else to sort of pave the way for you, it's a definite bonus. But another interesting thing about this trip is that, especially at the beginning of it, there was a lot of emphasis on security. The whole fellowship started out with 3 days of security training in Uganda. And this was on security for ourselves as journalists on the ground, as well as for our sources and how to protect the people that we're working with. And what I learned in these 3 days, it was incredibly valuable. And a lot of it I wish I had known or had the chance to go through years ago, especially when living in Cambodia and encountering some violent situations, things like that. But going into Rwanda, this was especially important too, because like many other countries where the government has very strict control, there are issues about, are you being watched? Are you being spied on? Do the people around you, do the government authorities know that you're a journalist? Are they following you? Is your room bugged, your hotel room? And in that, is your data safe? If you have a laptop or a phone and you go into a country that has these sort of strict government controls, and especially if they're technologically savvy, are they hacking into your data? And a real consideration in that is, okay, so nobody wants their own data or their own information to be hacked into, but if you have a phone and you have the phone numbers and the contact information for the sources you're working with, or your fixers, will the government or will somebody be able to find those people? Because as journalists, often what happens to us if we end up in a sticky situation, maybe we'll get kicked out of a country, maybe we'll be detained for a while. But we have to think about what happens to the people we've worked with, and are they in danger because of what we're doing there? Another thing we talked about was having the proper permissions to be in a place. Now, every country, every culture is different, but in Rwanda, for example, there were 6 reporters in my group, and we all had to carry permission papers from the government saying, we have legitimate reason to be here, asking questions of people in public, because in Rwanda, you can't just go up to somebody in public and start asking all sorts of questions. That can actually get you arrested. And that did happen to one of my colleagues. There was a misunderstanding, and she and her fixer were detained for several hours because they were in a cafe talking to people publicly, asking questions. And then also, do you have an emergency plan? One thing that we spent a lot of time on in the security training was going over what happens if things go terribly wrong. What if you're kidnapped? What if you are detained? Do you have a way to get that information out to other people who can try to help you? And the group that I went with, IWMF, is actually developing an app for reporters called Reporta. It's not out yet, but do keep it in mind and take a look for it down the road, because I think it could be very useful depending on where you're working and what you're doing. But basically, it's an app. It will have a panic button on the front of your phone. There are some quirks that they have to work out, but the idea is that if you hit the panic button, you are able to instantly send a message to the contacts you choose. So that might be your editor, it might be your parents, it might be your spouse, but the people you choose will be alerted that something has gone wrong. Okay. So these 3 days of security training were conducted by this group, Global Journalist Security, and they do all sorts of trainings around the world on physical security, how to react in a mob. These are pictures that were taken when Jerry and I were living in Cambodia and some of the things we encountered there. But this group really tries to train journalists how to be safe in physically dangerous situations. And then also first aid training. This is what I really wish I had had years ago, because it was incredible, useful stuff that could be used anywhere in the world for any sort of emergency, anything from traffic accidents to this scenario shows here a bullet wound. And in the past, I think, well, if somebody is shot in front of me, I don't really know what to do. I would call 911 if I were in the US, or I'd try to, flag down help. But now I actually feel like I'd be able to do something to help save the person's life. And it's really basic first aid training. I don't know how many of you have had that, but if you're going into other countries or, risky areas, it's very useful. And then another thing that we focused on was this idea of having a sixth sense as a journalist, listening to your gut feelings, your intuition. And this was in terms of both staying safe, physically, personally, as well as digging up stories and developing sources and gaining access to places and working in cultures we're not a part of. So we all have, those sorts of gut feelings at times that tell us, I don't know, something just isn't right about this situation. Well, statistically, studies show that often those gut feelings are spot on, and that we should listen to them, especially when we're working as reporters in places that are sort of out of our element. So it's really important to listen to that. Okay, so I wanted to get into the question of how do we find stories and how do we develop sources on the ground? And I'm going to tell you a little story. It seems like at least once a month or every few weeks, I get an email from somebody out of the blue, often a stranger, asking me, I'm going to X country, I'm going to this city or this part of the world. Do you know a fixer who can help me? Do you know somebody who can, show me the stories there, or tell me the stories, or lead me to the contacts I need? And these sorts of messages often, I'm very wary of giving that sort of information directly to people, especially if I don't know them, I don't know how they work, what their background is, because this journalist-source relationship, or the journalist-fixer relationship, it's a delicate one. It can be a tricky one, and everybody works differently. Everybody has different needs. Every journalist does. Every source or fixer on the ground does. And it's happened so many times where I've given people contacts, and then I hear afterward that it's gone terribly wrong, either for the source or the fixer or for the journalist, for various reasons. And maybe, it's not anybody's fault. It just doesn't work out. And what this is leading me to is the idea of going to a place, spending a lot of time and developing your own sources and your own networks on the ground. Jerry and I often talk about this idea of slow journalism. It's the same sort of concept as like slow food, but applied to journalism. And this doesn't, obviously, financially, this often doesn't work. A lot of people simply don't have the time or the budget to do this. But if you have the opportunity and you're really trying to get at the heart of an issue or a story or a culture, if you have the opportunity to spend a few extra days, even weeks, depending on what the story is, and really just kind of hanging out, getting a feel for what's going on around you, walking around, talking to taxi drivers, talking to cafe owners, listening to what people are saying on the street. These are the stories that are being talked about locally. These are the things that are on people's minds right now. No matter what you're reading in the press or what you're reading in NGO reports or what you're hearing from officials, this is sort of the vibe that we're getting on the ground. And then also making friends with local journalists. I've done a lot of media trainings in other countries, and it is such a hugely rewarding experience for all sorts of reasons, but it also has the added benefit of giving me these large networks of local journalists who are the best connected people to know as a foreigner trying to go in and report on issues. So if I know that I'm going to Myanmar and I have an idea in mind of what I would like to look at, I get online and I start emailing my friends whom I've met through these media trainings because they're the ones reporting on these issues day to day. So even from afar, even if you don't have that opportunity to go to a place beforehand, if you can somehow make friends with local journalists, just email people out of the blue, get to know them, ask them what's, what are the important issues, or this is the story that I'm thinking about. Is that really what's going on here? Tell me from your experience. Okay. But obviously, what I'm talking about here doesn't always work because sometimes we don't have the time. And for example, the trip that I took to Rwanda, we had to use fixers. It was a short time frame, and it was the first time that the group had actually worked on the ground in Rwanda. They've worked in all of the surrounding countries, but this was kind of new to them. And so we all used fixers. Now, ideally, I don't prefer to, I don't like the term fixer because, as I was saying, I prefer to develop my own sources and people I connect with, as opposed to hiring a stranger to lead me to the stories or help, pave the way to do the reporting. And there are issues that you have to consider if you are hiring someone you don't know to help you in a different place. Is that person a spy? This came up with the fixers we worked with in Rwanda. There were rumors that some of them were spies working for the government. They often have their own biases politically, or gender biases, personality differences. Sometimes, if you are using a fixer to translate, maybe the translation they give you is their interpretation or what they want you to hear and not exactly what the person said. So it looks like there are some questions ready. So how about we take a few minutes to answer questions, and then we can move along.
Yeah, hi, Karen. Most of these are questions that have come in so far are related to questions around security and fixing. Although we agree we don't like that term. So, somebody asks, from your experience, what are the qualities that a good fixer should have?
That's a very good question. I think the person has to be honest, and it's hard to gauge that if you don't know the person. So if you can, always try to meet with them, or at least have a really long Skype conversation or something with them beforehand. But honest and hardworking, also the ability to sort of put their own bias aside. This came up a lot in Rwanda, where some of the fixers are very, very, very pro-government. And you might not be able to avoid that, but you want to try to find somebody who can put their own feelings aside and understand your needs. They have to be able to understand what you need and that they're working for you and not just trying to show you what they want you to see.
Okay, cool. And a couple of very sort of practical questions, really. Somebody asks, when you're traveling to different countries, do you state in your visa request that you're a journalist, or do you go on a tourism visa?
Almost never do I go on a journalist visa. Almost always I go on a tourist visa, except, with this Rwanda trip, it was all done officially. There was government approval, and we had business visas, but the government knew that we were journalists there. But
Okay.
usually where I go, if I had put journalist down, I wouldn't be going back there. I'd probably not get in, or I'd be followed.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. And this final question for the time being, which is becoming more and more relevant, I guess, as big media organizations cut back on their foreign reporting budgets. So a lot of people are reporting as freelancers now, not as
Mm-hmm.
staffers. So the question is, how should freelancers prepare regarding security issues when you haven't got the backup of a big media organization behind you if things go wrong?
Yeah, that is a really tough question, and you're right. It's come up a lot lately, especially as more freelancers are being shot or killed or kidnapped. There's no easy answer to that. If you have a chance to take one of those courses, like I did through IWMF, the Global Journalist Security course, I highly recommend it. Obviously, there's an expense there too. If you have to pay out of pocket, maybe you're not able to do that, but maybe you can get an editor to pay for that. If not, they're online groups, they're global investigative journalism groups that you can post questions to, and just ask other people who have worked in these places. What is it like on the ground there? What should I be prepared for? Before I moved to Cambodia the first time, this was years ago, when there wasn't even very much email in the country at the time. But I got in touch with somebody, a guy from the U.S. who had been working there for quite a while, and asked him, what is it really like? I mean, what's day to day? How dangerous is it? I think that's really important if you really don't know what the situation on the ground is.
Okay, great. So I'll come back to you in a bit with some more questions, but in the meantime,
Okay. All right. So moving along from the idea of working with fixers, another way that obviously a lot of journalists get entry into a situation or a culture is through NGOs, because obviously NGOs are often the groups that are working with particularly remote communities or minority communities, communities that are often marginalized, not of the mainstream. And so NGOs can be a very good way to get you into a place and show you what's going on, and also be a storyline, a narrative. But there are some cautions that I think are really important to consider. Every NGO has some sort of agenda. I mean, that's how they get their funding. They do a certain kind of work, and they have a mission, an agenda. Now, maybe that agenda is harmless. Maybe it's completely in line with what you're trying to report on. But it's important to realize that they're not seeing the whole picture the way a journalist does. Another issue I've encountered a lot, and this happened again in Rwanda, is the NGO officer or the NGO person asking for money. Because often you think, especially if it's a local NGO, you think, well, there's a foreigner showing up. Foreigners always have money. Obviously, they have money if they can afford to fly into the country and show up in this place. So if you think about it from their perspective, it's kind of natural that they would think, well, maybe this journalist should give us the money to help this community and help this issue. And there's no easy way to explain that is not what journalists do. I usually try to say, well, as a journalist, I'm not an NGO. I don't have NGO funding. I can't give money. I don't give money, but I would hope that through the stories I write and publish, eventually that will come around to some sort of benefit for the community. But that's a long time to wait for people who are hungry on the ground now. So it's a really tricky situation. Another thing about NGOs is that they are often in competition with other NGOs for the same funding, because the same foundations will fund, various groups in a region or a country. And so they're all fighting for that pot of money. And so again, that just gives each NGO a type of slant or, an angle to how they view a situation. And then the final consideration I would say is that it's really important to question, okay, if you are going into a place with an NGO and that NGO is working against the government or the status quo, or is in some way an enemy to the authorities, or at least watched closely by the authorities, especially if they're working. This happens a lot with NGOs that work with minority groups in places where there are human rights abuses. Does your presence harm the people in that NGO or the people in the area, in the village where you're going? Because if you stand out as a foreigner going into this place with an NGO worker or going to a remote village, and when I work in Asia, I stand out. I don't look like an Asian person, so it's pretty easy to spot me. Does your presence then harm the people there? Does that, if a government official sees you in that place, do they then start asking, well, what is she doing there? And, what do they then follow up afterward? Do they go into the village and harass them? This is, it's something we have to ask ourselves about every place we go in with an NGO. Okay. So again, as I was saying, some of these things did come up when I was in Rwanda. I had the chance to go to a Batwa village, and the Batwa, they're the third ethnic group that people often don't hear about in Rwanda. They're the Hutus and the Tutsis. They're also the Batwa, the minorities, and they are statistically the poorest people in the country, and they often don't have land. In this village, as you can see, their homes were built right under these big power lines, but the people themselves had no power. And the school children, here, they're standing on a hillside, and then there's this sort of valley that dips down, and then way over there on the far side is where these kids would walk to school every day. It was a few miles each way. So I was able to go to this village through an NGO, and again, a lot of those things that I just talked about came up where the NGO worker wanted money, and it was just really hard to explain that no, I went with another reporter. We were working in pairs at the time. It's really hard to get that message, especially when you see people who are struggling just to make ends meet. In this village, a few years ago, they started up this kiln and they were making cook stoves. But before that, most of the people had no work whatsoever, and I interviewed a lot of them about food security and how they told me how often they didn't have enough to eat, maybe only one meal a day, maybe not even that. So I'm just telling you these examples because I think before you go anywhere like this, it's important to prepare yourself for how you might answer people who see you as a rich foreigner coming in, taking things, taking information, and then seemingly not offering anything in return because we don't have anything to give them except the hope that maybe what we write will somehow help them. But I think it is incredibly important to try to get these local voices on the ground for all sorts of reasons because you read NGO reports, you read a lot of government reports, you read a lot of news stories, and the local people often are not represented, or if they are, maybe they're just an anecdote. They're not they're used as the sort of draw into the story, but then it's all about quotes from officials or statistics or numbers, and not the people who are directly affected on the ground. And often their story is very different from what's put out officially. Another thing to think about is that NGOs, I've had this experience where NGOs often speak for local people, and this happens a lot with minorities, but they don't speak with them. And I've had the experience where NGOs have tried to protect locals from talking to journalists or talking to people because they feel like they're their clients and they want to protect them. And yet when I go and find the people on my own, I realized they really want to talk. They want to get their story out there. Okay, it looks like we have a couple more questions.
So somebody asks a very practical question. If you're going to report from a refugee camp, do you need to have accreditation? Or how do you get that accreditation? Where do you get it from? And the second question we have here is relating to when you were saying about explaining that your media, you're not from an NGO, but how do you kind of explain to people who may not really understand the concept of how media works in kind of Western democracies that you're not in with them, that you're independent from them?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Going back to the refugee camp question, I actually have never reported from a refugee camp. My husband has, and he has had to get, this was in Thailand on the Thailand-Myanmar border, and he had to get extensive permission from the UN, and it was a UN camp that he was going to, as well as the Thai military he needed permission from. And it was a lot of paperwork, and it took a long time. And that seems to be fairly similar to other experiences I've heard about with other reporters. As far as explaining, the media and how the media works in a country like the U.S. to places that don't have it, that's really hard too. I had this experience in December. We were reporting in Belize in a rural Maya community, and we were looking at vanilla and chocolate and cacao growing. And we ended up staying with this family that actually runs a small homestay as a side business. But they have this big, beautiful farm. It's actually an agroforestry project. And everything was fine for the first couple of days. We were very clear right up front that we're journalists. We're doing a story. We're taking video and audio and all of this. And then on the second day, the guy, the head of the household, just came up to Jerry and said, "You're taking too many pictures. If you want to continue, you have to pay more." Because the standard price, we were paying, a price for the room and the meals as anybody else would, because that's, they were offering that like a homestay. But because he felt like we were taking so much from him, I mean, his knowledge, his place to him was what it was his, value, and we were taking that. And it was so hard to try to explain that we were doing this for journalism, for educational purposes. And it didn't, in the end, it just didn't work. We ended up staying there, but he just said, "You can't do any more video." And at that point, we realized, all right, that's the end of that. We went on and talked to other people. We stayed there another night as we'd planned, but there was no easy way to sort of smooth that over.
Yeah, and I guess this is related to that question. Is somebody asks, have you ever had to pay to get access to an interview? I mean, this is kind of the tricky issue of do you pay bribes or not?
Right. No, I don't pay bribes. But like I said, if somebody is feeding us or giving us a bed, a place to stay, I would do as I would do for a hotel or anywhere else, looking at that as their business when it is. Often, yeah, I mean, sometimes people sell handicrafts, things like that. That in that village in Belize too, the women had this whole array of handicrafts, and so they wanted me to come over and look at it, and I bought some gifts to bring home, just as I would in a market or anywhere else. But just outright paying people for an interview, I don't do, and often, sometimes in some places people just won't talk to you then, but often they do.
Yeah, cool. Okay, and talking of which, how do you get this is kind of going back to the fixer issue a little bit, but very quickly, how do you how do you work out when you're going to a country where you don't speak the language? How do you kind of approach finding the best fixer in that opportunity, in that situation?
Yeah, it's kind of different in every place I go. When I was living in Asia, when I work in Asia, I speak enough Khmer and Cambodia to get around and do basic interviews. But if I need a lot more than that, I will hire somebody. And sometimes it's a person whose job it is professionally to be a translator or an interpreter. Sometimes it's just some kid who's studying English and really wants the practice and a little bit of extra money. And you have to consider who's doing the translating again, because it's never going to be perfect. But it's important to, even if you don't speak the language, to try to develop an awareness of people's body language and what's going on around you, so that you can try to determine if what the translator is telling you is actually what the person's saying. And it's a skill. It's hard to define, but you'll find yourself developing that the more experience you have working in other places and other languages.
Cool. Okay, thanks for that. I've got a few more, but we'll come back to them later. I'll let you crack on there.
Okay. So getting back to the idea of local voices, another key reason why I think it's so important to talk to locals on the ground is often the story that they have is not the story that is being told nationally or internationally. And I'm going to give you an example here of a different story that Jerry and I did in Laos on the Nam Tun 2 Dam, which is this massive hydroelectric project that provides now a lot of power, most of it going to Thailand, and not a lot of it going to the local people. And in the construction of this dam, dozens of villages were relocated. It flooded a huge biologically diverse wildlife area. Internationally, this whole project was pretty much certain to be a failure, or just not a very good thing. And we went there. We've been there a few times. We went there initially with Jim Harris, who I talked about at the start, because he was working with a group that was clearing bombs from the lands that were being turned into new villages. As these villagers were relocated, the company that was working on the dam had a bomb clearance team to go out and clear the land before they built their new houses, so that they wouldn't be building houses on contaminated land that might blow up. And that actually is a major part of the story that has not been told very well internationally, because most of the reports that have come out about this dam are quite negative and focus on the problems. However, we did find a good aspect to the story. So here's a family. They hadn't moved yet. They were waiting for their new house to be built, but you can see it was a very traditional style wood and thatch home, and their land had not been cleared. So they were possibly living atop bombs right there. Whereas here's an example of one of the newer homes, concrete, much sturdier. This family had a bit of money, and they also had a shop inside. But this guy used to be a farmer. He actually said he didn't mind having to. When the land was flooded, he had to stop farming, and now he buys his rice and he drives a truck for the power company. And he said he doesn't mind because he's actually making more money, and it was a good thing for him. And then this woman is standing in her yard, and that's her new house in the background, which was built by the dam company. And you can't see it in the picture, but for the first time in her life, she is working to clear her land for agricultural fields. And she is certain that there are no bombs in it, because the bomb team came in, the clearance team came in and removed all the ordnance. So she said she feels safe for the first time in her life. Before that, she was living on land that wasn't cleared. And that is an example of a story. If I had not gone there and talked to her directly, if I'd only relied on the NGO and the government reports and the outside reports, I wouldn't have known that aspect to the story. I mean, it's a happy story. It's a good thing. And yet I wasn't reading this in most of the other reporting that I was seeing coming out of here. So, talking about reporting on the ground, how do we do it? What do we actually do when we're there? I like to I like to call it sort of bottoms up, where, as I've been saying, I like to talk to locals first and officials later for several reasons. But like I was saying, because I think that locals have different ideas of what their stories are than what the officials will say, obviously. But also, if you start at the top talking to officials and authorities, there's a much greater chance that, if they don't like what you're doing, or they don't like the questioning, or, they feel like something's up, maybe you're going to get kicked out, or maybe there's going to be, a stop put to that story, or maybe they're going to start watching you. But if you start on the ground and talking to locals first, depending on where you are, you might just look like a tourist talking to villagers. And you can gather all this material and then go back and question the officials later to the extent that you can. Another thing is that I like to go to a place with a topic in mind, but not necessarily the story or the narrative. Because, let me give you another example here. This is a story from the Kelabit Highlands in Borneo. It's the interior of Borneo along the Malaysia-Indonesia border. And I've been there a few times. And the whole area around these people, it's a minority group that used to live in the jungle, but now much of that jungle is gone. And you can see here from the view from the sky, these are all logging roads. However, the Kelabit people still have some jungle around them, and this is where traditionally for centuries these people have gotten their food. They hunt, they grow rice, they forage for an incredible diversity of plants. And it is one of the most biologically diverse areas on the planet. Now, before I went there, and they hunt wild boar, and they ate things like pretty ginger flowers. Before I went there the last time, 2 years ago, people kept telling me, oh, you have to look into palm oil, because we've all heard the story that so many forests in Borneo and that whole region are being cleared for palm oil plantations. But I didn't pitch that to anybody. I had friends and editors saying, oh, you should pitch a palm oil story. But I didn't pitch that before I went. And it's a very good thing that I didn't, because when I went back there, I realized there is no palm oil here. In the places that have been cleared, there's no palm oil. Why is that? Because it won't grow at the elevation where these people live. And I didn't know that beforehand, but if I had pitched a story on palm oil, then I would have been screwed, because I didn't have a palm oil story. But I did come back with all sorts of other stories that I found on the ground, and there was no way that I could have predicted what they were. Okay. Did we have a couple more questions? I can't tell if that was your message from before, Martin.
That was my message from before, actually, but I have one that it's good to ask it, and that is, do you ever, when you're interviewing people, so you're referring there to the kind of order that you like to do it, locals first, officials last, but when you're talking to, do you ever pretend, or do you ever hide the fact that you're a journalist, or are you always upfront about the fact that you're a reporter and that's what you're there for?
Are you talking about when I'm talking to locals or officials, or both?
Well, both, I guess, yeah.
Okay. I don't like trying to hide that I'm a reporter, but what happens a lot is that, and this used to happen, for example, in the old Myanmar before the country started changing, and to some extent today still, but I don't say directly to a person that I'm a journalist. If I'm in a place where I know that can be a problem, not only for me, but for them, because if a person has been told, if I say to so-and-so, I am a journalist, and they know that, and then the authorities know that they've been told they're talking to a journalist, they could get in trouble. However, I make sure that there's a mutual understanding. Those people know exactly why I'm asking questions. And often what I end up saying is that, and through a translator sometimes, is conveying the idea that I'm an American, and I'm really interested in your story, and I want to go home and tell other Americans about your story. But I don't necessarily use the word journalist. Talking to officials, usually it ends up that I say that I am a journalist, although I guess thinking back, there must have been times when I didn't. um, I don't like, obviously I don't like lying or trying to hide it, but there are ways, I think there are ways around coming out with that statement, I'm a journalist, so that you don't hurt yourself and you don't hurt the people you're talking to, but that they know exactly what you're doing. And they realize that, this information is going to get out.
Exactly, and I guess the kind of flip side to that coin is, somebody else asks, do you find that people are very eager, especially, we're not talking about officials here, but locals, interviewees, very eager to kind of let you in and to talk because they know that you can get the word out, that you can tell people about whatever problem they've got.
Yes, yes, and actually, I was going to get to that in the next slide here.
Okay.
There's a lot of talk about the right to privacy, but there's also the right to speak. And as I think I mentioned earlier, I've dealt with a lot of NGOs. It came up a lot when Jerry and I were reporting our book on unexploded ordnance in Laos, where the NGOs are under strict scrutiny from the government, and they're very, very careful. But they also like to protect their clients there as they see them. And so there were times when we would try to go through an NGO to, say, find bomb accident victims. And they, no, you can't, it's really touchy, you can't talk to that person, or if you talk to them, it has to be in our office in a very controlled environment. And yet, other times I would go out, sort of go around the back door in a different way and go to the village directly and find these people and realize they want to talk. They want to get their story out there. And they often don't have that chance, especially in a country where there isn't a free press. Think about that. It's hard for people to get their story out. So somebody comes and asks, questions, what happened to you? Tell me, I want to tell other people. This is their opportunity to actually get their story out. And another example from that was we had gone to a hospital because we'd heard that there was a boy who had a bomb accident. And the hospital, especially at that time, there was no way that we could have gone in officially, or we went in with a local friend of ours, very much under the radar. We sort of snuck through the door, but got into the hospital room, and our friend was translating, and the boy was there with his mother, and we talked to her for quite a while, and she was very happy to have this chance to speak. Yet, if we had tried to, knock on the door and go in, with a big presence, the doctors and nurses and the hospital officials would not have allowed us to do that. Backing up just a second here, I wanted to just go. Finding a doorway or finding some sort of common ground, some way to relate to people on the ground. And for me, as I mentioned before, since I'm a food writer and I have a food blog and I'm very much into cooking, I often use food as a way to connect with people, because food is benign, right? Everybody eats, everybody likes to eat for the most part. Lots of people like to talk about the foods that they eat in their cuisines. And a lot of times in villages, women, the first thing that happens when you enter a village is the woman, the mother's going to bring you into her house and offer you something to eat, or at least a cup of tea or something. So it's a way to connect with people. And then after I'm learning how she makes a dish, I find out, the problems that they're having with their rice crop, or problems that they're having with authorities who are trying to take over their farm fields, or, you name it, whatever the issue is that somehow relates to food. But food is the way that we've connected. And it doesn't have to be food. I mean, maybe for you it's music, or maybe it's sports, or something. Maybe it's children. Maybe you have kids the same age as the people you're talking to, but finding a way to relate to the people and then using that as a way to get them to open up and trust you to talk about other issues. Okay. So moving on to writing the story. So you've gone out, you've gathered all of this material, a ton of it, way more than you can possibly use. Then obviously you have to write the story or put the pieces together, whether it's, maybe it's a video or an audio slideshow, whatever. You have to put it together into a story. And as I was saying earlier, there's a problem that I'm encountering more and more in that editors and publishers seem to really want a narrative. They want a character-driven story, almost like fiction, before they'll say yes to publishing it. And that's really tricky because, as I also pointed out, often we don't know what that story is. We don't know who the main character is until we're on the ground. I think, though, it's important to think about when you set out to do a story and then try to pitch it. You obviously have to figure out a narrative that is true to the story and the issue. I mean, obviously, you don't want to be steering the story in a particular direction just to create a narrative that readers will like. It's important to make sure that you are true to the issue. But it has to sell. You have to persuade an editor or publisher that this is a storyline their readers will be interested in. And it has to keep the audience hooked. It has to be something that, readers can read all the way through or stick with you all the way through. And again, it's really, really tricky to do that. Certainly before you've come back from a reporting trip, but then even afterward, how to frame all of this material, because you have so much. How do you weed through it and put it together in a way that accomplishes this? So when I do storytelling workshops and media workshops, I often refer to the writer John McPhee, who has had these guidelines. He basically says that most stories are arranged in one of three ways: either topically, in that each chunk or section of the story is about a particular topic within the story, or they're chronological. They start in whatever year, month, or week, and then move forward chronologically. Or sometimes they're geographical, in that the story moves physically, like across a map, from one place to another to another. But the idea is that you often think of the parts of a story almost like movie scenes, so that they're somehow cinematic. And each main section of the story is its own little piece, its own little story within, almost like, as I said, a movie scene, and that there is a thread that pulls the audience through. So maybe it's, I don't know, it's some sort of theme or some sort of character, a person who keeps popping up, or an image that keeps popping up to pull the audience along. And then something else that I recommend when I'm giving my workshops, and I try to do this for myself as best that I can, because it can be so overwhelming, especially if you're working on a big project or a complicated story, in determining, how do you stick to the narrative? How do you keep it on track? Write yourself a synopsis, write yourself an outline before you even begin. And go back to those same principles we've learned as journalists: who, what, when, where, why, and how. Answering those questions, but writing them out. Who specifically is the story about? What is it about? When does the story take place? Where does the story take place? Why did this happen? Why is this a story? How did it happen? And I found, I think to myself, oh yeah, I know the answers to those questions, but if I don't actually go through this step of writing it out, sometimes I realize when I start writing, it's not so clear to me. Or I don't realize at the beginning, if I don't go through these steps, that there's a hole. So maybe I get to the what, or maybe I get to the why, I'm writing the synopsis, and I realize, oh, it's not completely clear in my head. And if it's not completely clear in your head, it's not going to be completely clear in the editor's head or the audience's head. So I find this really important to do. But then I recommend doing it a second time for pitching the story. Because, and this is, it's the same questions you're answering, but you're doing it for the editor. Before you pitch the story, before you send the query, write out, okay, who is doing the story? So in that case, it's you or your team or your company, but you're the reporter. You're doing the story. What is the story? That is the synopsis that you just came up with. You know, clear nugget of, you know, this is the story synopsis. When will the story be finished? Will it take you, is it done already? Will it take you a week? Will it take you a month? Will it, you know, is this a long-term story that you need a whole year to report? Where will the reporting or the production happen? Is this something that you need to travel for? Are you going to one particular village? Or is this something that you're mostly doing from home or from your office right now? You know, reporting, you've done some on-the-ground reporting. That part is over. You're in the production stage and you're nearly there. Why? And this, the why is really critical here when you're pitching. Why is this an important story right now for this publication that you're pitching to by you? Why are you the person to be writing this story rather than somebody on staff? And believe me, I have had so many my own experiences as well as friends of mine, colleagues, who have pitched a story as a freelancer and then found out, you know, a couple of months later that the editors turned around and assigned that story to somebody on staff. So, and it's a terrible thing that happens to freelancers, but it does. And there's often no way of avoiding that. However, if you can successfully argue that you are the right person and the only person to be doing this story because you have some special expertise or you have some special access or history or whatever, then it's less likely to happen. But each publication is different. I mean, when you put a pitch together, it should be different for each publication that you pitch to, because each publication has a different audience, and you need to try to figure out why the story fits that particular niche or that particular audience, and why right now. If you can't answer those things successfully, then it's way too easy for an editor to say, no, it's not quite right for us right now. And then the last thing, how will you deliver the story? Pretty basic, but are you talking about a 1,000-word story? Are you talking about a 5,000-word story? Do you have photos? Do you have audio? Do you have multimedia? What exactly are you offering here? It seems pretty simple, but often I've found that people forget to tell the editor exactly what they're offering, and then the edit, you know, this shows up in the editor's inbox, and they're like, well, I don't know, is this a front of book thing? Is it a short story, or is this like a main feature? What are we talking about here? If you can get all this into your pitch in a short, succinct pitch from the get-go, your chances are much greater that that you'll at least pique the editor's interest, and he or she won't just dump it from the start. Okay. And this takes me into the Logan Symposium in investigative reporting, which Jerry and I had the opportunity to attend last month in Berkeley. And this is an annual event that's put on through the Graduate School of Journalism there. And it was phenomenal. It's like a conference on investigative reporting, but the difference is that it brings together reporters, editors, publishers, and funders. So we're talking about people who run the MacArthur Foundation, people who run all sorts of journalism foundations, or the granting agencies that give those organizations money, so that you have these 3 days to schmooze with people who actually have the money. And this, the longer I do this whole freelancing thing, the more and more important I'm finding this in really nailing down your 2-minute elevator pitch, or your 2-minute synopsis of who you are and what you do, or even a 20-second synopsis of who you are and what you do and why you stand out, so that you can make your mark in somebody's mind and that they will remember you when it comes time for giving out grant money or funding a story, or giving you travel money to go report on something that you think is important. Because well, okay, so what did I take away from that? Again, when we're thinking about how to get our stories, our work out there, what do publishers really want? Again, they are character driven. They want narratives. For better or worse, they want storylines. They want, journalism today almost to read like fiction. And that has a lot of problems, but that is what is selling. And it's really important for us to keep that in mind. They also want to know about impact, and I hate that word, but they want to know if you have a story that is somehow going to create change. And if so, how are you going to measure that? How do you measure the impact? What sort of evidence, what sort of metrics are you using? Is it like clicks on a story? Or how are you going to convey to the publisher, the editor, that your story is going to make change and that it truly has an effect? Why is this important? Because so much of journalism today is funded through nonprofit foundations, and they demand that information. So when a journalism group applies for a grant from a funding agency, they have to show that their stories are somehow having an impact. So as the freelancer, at the bottom of the totem pole on the ground, trying to pitch an individual story, you also have to show how this story is going to have an effect, how it's going to create some larger change in society, either your own society or the society you're reporting on. And again, I think there's some big cautions there, because I often wonder, well, if we have such a drive for characters and narrative, and we have such a drive for this impact, does that alter our reporting? Does it shape the way we do our stories? And I think about years ago in Cambodia, I worked with a reporter who I would walk by her desk sometimes, and she would basically write her whole story, but she would have these big holes in the center. Get so-and-so to say XYZ. Find someone to say this. Find an anecdote about that. And, sometimes we can honestly do that if we have done enough reporting to know that this is the direction the story truly is taking. But you got to wonder, if is that always the case? Is that always true? Or are we creating stories and then leaving holes and directing ourselves to go find someone to say this for me, so that I can write the story in the sort of narrative that a publisher or an audience will want? And I think there's a big, big danger in that. Okay, before I move on, are there any other questions?
Yeah, Karen, I have a bunch of questions actually, which are related to what you've just been talking about. So I'll rattle through them. How do you decide where or what you're going to report on next time? Do you prefer to follow stories that are trending, or do you prefer to go for unreported stories? And, depending on which of those are kind of easier to pitch, I guess.
Yeah, actually, I would say try for a combination. My tendency is to go for stories that are under or unreported, but the problem with that is if it's too underreported, it's really hard to get an editor's interest. And this, this is the case with our book on Laos and all of the stories that we did related to that. Well, if it's something the editor hasn't heard of, that person's, he or she is afraid that their audience isn't going to care because it's unknown. However, if something happens in the news that you can somehow tie in to the issue that you would like to look at that's underreported, and say, okay, this has happened, so now this is important, this underreported aspect of it. That's I've found is often the best way to get it in front of editors.
And this next one is, I think, something that's happened to virtually all of us at one time or another. So you go on your story, you discovered it's actually not as interesting as you thought it was going to be, or that news agenda has overtaken, and it doesn't. There's no room for it in the bulletin, or there's no room for it in the magazine, or whatever. How do you explain to the people that you interviewed, to the people who contributed to the story, that actually they're not going to see themselves in print, or they're not going to see themselves on TV?
Yeah, that's a tough one. But usually I also try to say from the very beginning that I can't promise anything. I mean, I'm working on this story, but I can't promise that it's going to end up in this publication or in this way. And that has happened so many times where stories also get held for a long time. I just this past week I've been editing stories that the publishers have had for a year. So in the interim, people are waiting to see the story come out, and I just I try to be honest and say that it's not always in my hands. I don't
And a
know.
couple of very practical questions about the relationship with commissioning editors, with editors. You mentioned that sometimes editors are prone to take your story ideas and then cover them themselves using. So how do you do? I mean, is there anything you can do about that? I mean, is that content or that idea? It's not copyright, of course.
No, that's tricky. I mean, this is I belong to some email groups of different journalists, and it's come up a lot lately, and I'm not sure that anybody has really come up with a clear answer, except depending on what your situation is and what the publication is, maybe you want to make that known. I've known journalists who write about these things on their blogs. Now that can truly backfire too, because if you do that, well, then maybe that publication is never going to assign you a story. I had a case once where I had pitched a story to an editor who ended up writing the thing. Actually, just interesting. It was like an associate editor. He called me, interviewed me about, essentially, I didn't realize it was an interview at the time, but he was asking all sorts of questions about the story I'd pitched. And then it ends up that he wrote his own story, and I didn't even realize that. So when that happened, when that came out, I was very mad, and I went to his editor, higher up editor, who didn't realize that this had gone on, and they nothing. I mean, they didn't really solve the problem, but at least the higher up editor was aware, and he was very apologetic. And it was also, I mean, it was a way into the magazine talking with him directly that I wouldn't have had.
Yeah, well, actually, sometimes it can turn out like that, but it turns into an opportunity, but not very often, it has to be said.
Right.
Yeah. And finally, for now, do you prefer pitching a story before doing it or afterwards when it's finished?
Again, it's a mix, because, as I was saying, it happens so often, especially with the sorts of stories I do, where I'm talking about people in places that are really remote and not, not they're not people I can talk to online necessarily. I don't know what exactly the story will be until I get there. So if that's the case, usually what I'll do is try to let an editor know that I'm going to a place and I'm looking at this issue. And would you be interested in stories when I return? And then usually, that piques interest, and they're like, yeah, get in touch when you get back. So that's done a couple of things. It doesn't make me promise that I'm coming back with a particular story with a particular angle, yet I'm already on that editor's radar. And so when I send my return email saying, okay, this is the story that I found, I've already opened the door. We've already had a conversation. But on the other hand, sometimes if it's an issue that I've been working on for a long time, sometimes I do know clearly what the story is before I go, and then I will try to pitch it exactly as I think it's going to turn out, or at least the storyline as I expect it will turn out, because I've done enough background reporting on it already, and that way often you're able to get well, not often these days, but sometimes you're able to get the publication to pay your expenses
Sure.
up
Okay.
front.
I've got plenty more questions here, but why don't you finish what you wanted to say, and then if we have time, we can cover
Okay,
them. Otherwise, people can contact you directly, I guess, by email and stuff.
sure. Okay. So I just wanted to get into some of the funding opportunities. As I was saying, especially for freelance journalists anymore, it's critical to be aware of organizations that for a particular story or on a much larger scale for doing big projects, because lots of publications aren't paying their freelancers or even their staffers anymore to travel and to really look in depth at stories. So a few examples here. This is the Howard G. Buffett Fund for Women Journalists. It's a brand new thing this year, and it's put out through IWMF, the same group that I went to Rwanda with. And they have several $1 million over the course of several years to give out to women reporting internationally. The first deadline has passed, but another one will be coming up in the next few months. And something key to note about this organization, they are very much in favor of stories that either change traditional narratives or, shifting the story, or underreported issues in underreported places, especially Africa. ICFJ, the International Center for Journalists, this is another one. This is a group that I had a fellowship to go to Borneo a couple of years ago through, and they're no longer doing, unfortunately, that particular fellowship, but they do have a number of funding opportunities. SEJ, the Society of Environmental Journalists, is another group that I belong to, but they have their own fund for environmental reporting, and a lot of those stories are international. The Fund for Investigative Journalism is another group. For several years, they weren't funding international stories and projects, but they've started doing that again and are regularly looking for grant applications. The Investigative Fund was, I'd been aware of this, but the woman who runs it happened to be at that Logan Symposium and got to know her a little bit better, and the fund and what they do. It's another good thing to check out. And they have a rolling application system, so there isn't a strict deadline, but basically you just start off a conversation through an email, and if they're interested, they'll get back to you. The McGraw Fellowships for Business Journalism is another one I learned about at the Logan Symposium. It's a few times a year and up to $15,000 over the course of 3 months to work on a business journalism story, and many of those projects are international. And then another thing that a lot of my friends have done is crowdfunding campaigns, and I think there are pluses and minuses to this. I've never done a Kickstarter or any sort of crowdfunding campaign, but I've known lots of folks who are successful at it. The one major caution I would say is that several journalists I know who have successfully funded their projects through crowdfunding say it's great, except it's a one-time deal, because often it's a lot of your friends and family and your own network who will be pitching in, and you can't really keep going back to the same people, same friends and family asking for more money. But one time maybe it works. And then I would say if you can't travel, there's still really good ways through professional organizations and journalism groups to get connected from afar, or at least lead you in a good direction in trying to report something that you can't go out and do everything on it that you'd like. But this Global Investigative Journalism Network is, I find, very useful and informative. Other groups like here in the U.S., although there are international members, the Journalism and Women's Symposium, I just got involved with in the past year or so and went to their conference, and it was really especially supportive for women and minorities in journalism. And then I wanted to comment too that, as I was saying, a lot of times these days we don't have the money to travel to do particular stories, but with technology, sometimes you don't have to travel to do the story that you want to do. And this is just an example of something I did on the anniversary of the 2004 tsunami. I had been in Thailand at the time when it hit, and I reported on it then. And I wanted to do something for the anniversary, but I just didn't have the chance to go back this time. However, I was able now to connect with so many people through Skype and through the internet, and there was so much more data online that I was able to, pull an update story together on how technology has changed since the tsunami hit in 2004. And then one final thing before we just answer some more questions, I just wanted to talk about this idea of the duty to tell and getting the story out. I had a conversation with a colleague once, not too long ago, who was saying that often journalists, reporters do a really great job in the field gathering information, but then sometimes we fail on the return in actually getting the story out. And the thing is, if we don't get it out, we might have all of this knowledge inside of us, but it's not doing anybody any good unless we get it out. And the trick is trying to figure out how to reach as many people as possible. And I think when we take on a topic, when we take on a big issue, there are so many ways we can look at specific angles to a story to tell it in different directions to different audiences. So, and again, an example, I'm going back to the reporting that Jerry and I did on unexploded ordnance in Laos. So the book came out, but then the trick is how do we get the information about the book out? How do we reach as many people as possible? So last year, when Henry Kissinger came out with his new book, and he was doing interviews about the Vietnam War, and he was greatly downplaying, possibly lying about the civilian casualties. We did a point-by-point story in response for the Washington Post online. So that was one angle. Another was Lyndon Johnson's family was trying to sort of last year rebrand him and his legacy and shifting focus away from the Vietnam War. Well, I ended up doing a story for Al Jazeera, an opinion piece perspective on the fact that, okay, they're trying to shift it away from Vietnam, but you know what? Nobody ever talks about what happened in Laos. And that is still a huge part of his legacy. And then I did another story for an online magazine aimed primarily at women, but they cover all sorts of things. But in this case, Canada was debating a controversial bill over cluster munitions, and I focused on the women and children in Laos who have cluster munitions in their fields today. And then one more example of just a narrative story of one woman's life living with bombs in her yard that I did for another group that's aimed at change for women and girls around the world. And okay, any more questions?
We have a few more questions, Karen. Very quick, simple one to start. Well, not so simple, but quick. How do you measure impact? You were talking about impact earlier. How do editors like to measure it?
Oh, so you cut out there. I didn't get the last part of your question.
So I guess the thing is how you measure impact and how editors measure impact might be different concepts in a way. But how do you measure impact?
Right. Yeah. I'm going to admit I'm terrible at measuring impact, and I'm not sure. I don't honestly know the sort of impact that my stories end up having. I need to be better at this. But when I am applying for a grant, usually often there is a question about that, and often they'll want to know, like, what is your online presence? They want to get a feel for how connected you are to various audiences. So what I try to bring in is, without actually using data or numbers, because again, I'm terrible at that, I have wide-ranging audiences. So for example, I have a food blog that has a totally different audience from, say, a story, an opinion piece that I do for Al Jazeera or the Washington Post online, but I'm able to write about the same issues on my blog and get those people interested. I'm also a fellow at the Schuster Institute for Investigative Journalism at Brandeis, and they market their fellows' work and they help place stories and things like that. So, I highlight those sorts of things to say that it's not just me trying to get my story out and trying to, create an impact, that I have this institute behind me too. But yeah, I'm not good at numbers and impact.
Um, and this is a question that all of us have faced at one time or another when we're starting out. When you want to start reporting especially from the global south, you don't have any. How do you start? And is it a good idea when you're starting to offer your pieces for free just in order to get noticed?
Okay, both very good questions. I would say, again, if you've never started and you want to, and if you have some way of getting your foot in the door, whether it's through a fellowship out of the blue. I mean, a lot of like the IWMF, a lot of the people who were in that group with me had never really reported overseas. Same with ICFJ, the one that sent me to Borneo. Several in the group, they worked on staff for U.S. publications, and they'd never reported overseas. So if you can find some sort of entry through an organization that can pave your way and set up contacts and take care of all the like housing arrangements and food and stuff like that, then once you get there, you can get a feel for what's going on and see if you want to go back. Another way is, if you're really serious, get a job at a local paper. There are English language papers all over the world. They often hire foreigners, especially for, say, copy editing positions, because it's a job that you have to be a native English speaker to really do well. And it often doesn't pay well, but it's a fantastic way to really get to know a place. Or if not for a newspaper, getting some other sort of job in a country. Or at the very least, travel a bit, just if you can afford it. Take a vacation, look around, see what might be there for you to look into, and then start pitching ideas. Working for free. Yeah, that comes up a lot, and my advice is don't do it, because there are arguments that it can be a great way to get your foot in the door, get noticed, but when people work for free, then that gives the editor incentive to not pay other people, because if they can get a story for free from one person, well, then they don't want to pay somebody else as much, or maybe they don't want to pay at all, or maybe they only want to pay $100, and it's really tough.
And I think you also have to think about what it says about how you value your own work as well. I mean,
Exactly.
I completely agree with you, but what are the signals that you're giving off are that you don't actually value your own work very much. So, I completely agree. It's easy to say sometimes, but especially when you're starting out, it's a tricky one. But if you can possibly avoid it.
I would say that, I mean, there are some exceptions, and I think you have to weigh what the benefit is to you. I mean, sometimes maybe doing a story for a particular outlet is going to get you more in the end, or maybe it's a story that you really want to get out, a long form piece or something that you could submit to awards, or you could use as a clip then to get a fellowship or to get a grant or something like that. So you have to weigh the pros and cons, but.
Okay, and I think this is probably the last one that we'll have time for, but somebody asks, what do you think about creating news or creating stories based on what this person says Facebook statuses, but it could also apply to tweets, it could apply to any sort of online source really, but particularly social media. Is that I mean, there are all sorts of questions about, how you verify and so on. So how do you feel about using social media as a source for news?
Yeah, that's tough too. I mean, there is the question, how do you verify? But what I would say, the way that I've found social media to be very valuable is that it's allowed me to keep in touch with people and connect with people I never had any connection to before. So when I started doing this, I mean, there was none of that, and there was no way for me to actually talk to people on the ground unless I went there. These days, all over Asia, my primary means of communication is through Facebook. So often, I will use it as a tool, not necessarily as like a source or a way to take what people are saying online, although you can find ideas in that, but then find another way to actually be in touch. Find another way to talk to them directly, Skype with them or go there or something, spark an idea, but try to verify for sure.
Cool. Okay. Well, listen, Karen, that brings us neatly to the end. Thank you so much for your time today. As
Thank
always,
you.
it's been fascinating. And I guess if people do have any follow-up questions or anything they didn't think of, they can contact you directly.
Absolutely. Sure.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, well,
Thank
listen,
you so
thank you very
much.
much. And thank you from everybody on the chat room as well. And yeah, we'll speak to you next time. Okay,
Okay, great. Thanks.
cheers. Bye.